Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by Professor Walker Hanlon, and we are discussing his new book, very new book, The Laissez-Faire Experiment, Why Britain Embraced and Then Abandoned Small Government, 1800 to 1914. Walker, welcome to the show.
Great, thanks for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you came to work on this project?
So I'm an economic historian here at Northwestern University. And, I always wanted to write a book. Most economists write papers typically, but I was interested in writing a book. And if I did it, I wanted it to be on a topic that I thought was big and important. And, certainly the size of government is a topic that we're still arguing about. I think humans have been arguing about, sort of how big government should be and what it should do probably since government existed. So that seemed like the kind of big topic I could go after. And because I specialize in British economic history, I thought that there was really something we might be able to learn from Britain's experiment with really sort of laissez-faire government in the 19th century.
This is part of a series, right? Edited by Joel McKeer?
Yeah, by my colleague Joel McKeer down the hall of books on economic history. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I interviewed Martin Prock, and he had recently come out with a book in this series as well. And it was kind of by happenstance that I discovered this book was in the same series, but that was hopeful because I really liked his book and I really liked your book as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's one of the best series in economic history, definitely.
So this is definitely a big topic, big picture, interesting topic to me. I think you can imagine, I guess, laissez-faire reigning in some society just for kind of de facto reasons, maybe because the state simply lacked the effective authority or capacity to do all the things that it wanted to do. But I think you make the claim that the British embrace of small government was in large part deliberate and based on a particular worldview and set of convictions. Is that right? Or is there anything you want to add to why exactly Britain did initially embrace this small government worldview?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that, sort of laissez-faire in the sense of a limited government that doesn't do very much, right? That can exist in a society of basically anarchy, right? Just because the government is broken down. What makes the British case really interesting was this sort of very thoughtful, directed attempt to strip away and reduce the things that government had previously done, right? Which they had the capacity to do, but they just didn't want the government to be doing anymore. And that project basically grew out of the Enlightenment and changing ways of thinking about both sort of natural rights and political economy and, and how the economy functioned and the market worked. So that thinking, which came before, really fed into this idea that they could get government out of the economy and out of people's lives in a wide variety of different ways and reduce the amount of stuff it was doing, even though they had the capacity to do more.
So the time period we're talking about for your book, again, is 1800 to 1914, and you start roughly at 1800, but prior to that, you're claiming that Britain had not embraced laissez-faire prior to that. This is the kind of height is the early 19th century, right, of their embrace?
They're beginning this project in the very beginning of the 19th century, and that's being influenced by thinkers that had come before that, people like Bentham, people like Adam Smith. In a sense, it was a response to a much more interventionist form of government that existed before. So you can think in sort of the realm of trade, as sort of mercantilist trade policies. But the government was doing lots of things before this laissez-faire period. They were fixing prices of basic commodities. They were managing the economy in a lot of ways that essentially the laissez-faire advocates in the first half of the 19th century wanted to get rid of to allow the market to really determine, most prices, wages, and flows of goods and services.
My sympathies are very much on the side of against government intervention, but you can imagine that even with government intervention, there are more and less effective and more or less corrupt ways of doing it. So how effective, how corrupt, how venal was British interventionism prior to this period? Was it on the more effective and honest side, or on the more corrupt and, rent-seeking side?
I mean, it's hard to give a precise answer to that question, but I think there is a sense among economic historians that there was lots of sort of inefficiencies and to some extent some, a good amount of corruption in that system that existed before. And I think one of the motivations for the Laissez-Faire project was to try to get rid of that, sort of those opportunities and those inefficiencies, those opportunities for corruption and these just sort of this meddling in the economy and to unleash the market. And I think that they essentially did that, and it was pretty successful in sort of that first half of the 19th century.
Do you think that this initial embrace of small government, the small government worldview, was primarily held by elites, or was it shared by common people or the middle classes?
I think the right group of actors to think about here is some sort of combination of the middle classes, the commercial classes, and some of the aristocratic elites. But sort of the Liberal Party was, really tied up with industrialization and commerce. And so you had a lot of the commercial class that was really pushing this. The working class wasn't super politically active during this period. And so it wasn't by any means like a working class initiative.
Yeah, so this is a time, right, where the politically influential elites were shifting, right, from the traditional aristocratic classes to the rising wealthy commercial classes. And so all of a sudden there's a new group of people with influence and interest.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not driven entirely by the new group of people that are gaining political power in the wake of primarily the First Reform Act. Those people are an important part of it, but I think there's also a lot of convincing going on. And I think the ideas are percolating through all of the educated classes of society. That doesn't mean everybody's agreeing, but it didn't end up being a partisan project in that you see moves from both of the major political parties towards laissez-faire throughout the first half of the 19th century.
That's Whigs and Tories, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned like the Liberal Party. Was there an official Liberal Party, or is that more like an ideological description for people of any party who were on board with the kind of laissez-faire project?
The Whigs have basically become the Liberal Party at some point.
Can you give us like a brief outline of the types of things that caused Britain to eventually sour on the small government philosophy? And maybe we can go and pick out some in more detail, but what's the broad outline?
So a lot of the book is about this decision, once they've embraced laissez-faire, to move away from it. And the basic argument that I make is that what they're doing is really a very pragmatic and limited step-by-step response to specific problems that they're seeing in different areas of the economy, where the market has been sort of given the freedom to run, and then they see some issues that are not working so well. And I think those are exactly the kind of issues that now, using the tools of modern economics, we can understand. These are things like externalities or information problems. And those problems are being exacerbated by all of the growth and the urbanization and the international trade, the complexity in the economy that are coming out of the Industrial Revolution. And so as this pragmatic, really efficiency-focused response to that, they're basically chipping away at this edifice of laissez-faire by adding a little bit of regulation here and a little bit of regulation there, until by the end of the 19th century, they've essentially moved away from laissez-faire.
So you've got maybe a dozen or so chapters, each telling the history of like one particular area of society and how it first embraced and then abandoned small government, or at least that's the usual outline. I think several of the chapters kind of present some exceptions, but is there a particular chapter or area that you think is particularly representative of this whole story you're telling?
You see a little bit of a different pattern in every area, but the common pattern is this sort of either movement away from government intervention or a real refusal to have government intervention, and then this slow movement towards some sort of government intervention of typically somewhat limited variety. I'm not sure there's a representative chapter, but if you want, I'm happy to sort of point out a couple of the topics that I think display sort of important aspects of what's going on.
Maybe let's do railroads, if you don't mind, because I think I have some follow-up questions on the railroad chapter. What's the general story of how how laissez-faire was it in the beginning, and then how did they move away from laissez-faire?
Yeah, so railroads is really, obviously a really important issue in the middle of the 19th century, right? You get the sort of the introduction in the UK of the first railroads, and then this very rapid expansion. And what's true in the UK that's not true everywhere else is it's really driven by the private sector. Now, the government is always involved. One of the things that makes this special is that you essentially always have to have some government involvement because of the land acquisition problem that you have when you're trying to set up these large, railroad lines. You basically need some use of eminent domain or something like that for the private sector to be able to operate. But the government tries to sort of stay out of regulating the railroad to some extent, and they're slowly drawn in by a couple things. One is that there's concerns about safety on the railroads. There's some spectacular train wrecks, and I think that makes Parliament particularly concerned because they're the ones riding the trains early on. And then there's these coordination issues where there's some real obvious coordination inefficiencies, like differences in the gauge of the railroads, where government, sort of hopes that the private sector will take care of things. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. And when they don't, the government eventually by the middle sort of 1860s, 1870s is stepping in to try to help get that coordination happening. But I think just the one last thing I want to say about that is like, again, these are people who typically believe in laissez-faire, and they're intervening really to try to make this private market work more effectively.
So you just raised, this is one of the things I want to ask about. You just raised the idea that it was never feasible for the railroad industry to develop without government involvement in the form of eminent domain because of this holdout problem where, imagine you're trying to buy up enough land to build a railroad. You need a lot of land to do it. And if one well-placed landowner holds out for an exorbitant fee, they can scuttle the whole project, which, might be terrible for everyone. So my question is, was that like a theoretical conclusion that they reached, or was there actually a time when there was an attempt to build rail lines like this for a substantial period of time without the use of state intervention in the form of eminent domain, and then it failed for long enough that they stepped in, or was it kind of used at the outset on the assumption that it wouldn't work?
So the railroads, they're using this from the outset, and the reason that they're using it from the outset is that it already exists, this system. And the reason it already exists is because they've already gone through a huge expansion of the canal network, which faced essentially the same problems. And so they essentially just adopted the institutions that have been developed for the canal network to regulate the railroad.
But
Now,
by
there's
systems, you mean the eminent domain system?
yeah, well, just the institutional way of doing it, where they
Yeah,
would
yeah.
come to Parliament with a private bill, with a particular plan, and they would get approval to build on a particular plan. And often that would involve also an incorporation that would help protect investors. But there was actually one thing that they got wrong, which is kind of interesting, which is on a canal system, the boats, the actual service can be run by many separate individual operators. And they actually thought that railroads would be run that way, that there would be sort of one infrastructure provider and lots of independent operators running trains on the railroad. And they eventually, having tried that, they realized that that was infeasible because it was too dangerous to try to coordinate all of these separate train operators, and that they had to bring it basically all in-house. And so you ended up with these even larger, sort of, more powerful organizations.
Well, second question, and maybe this applies to the canal issue too, though canals might be more limited than railroads, but isn't one of the standard solutions to this holdout problem the idea of buying like development options to cover the possibility of multiple routes rather than initially purchasing the land so that the holdout problem gets reduced in that way? Was this not feasible for some reason?
That's a good question. I don't know actually whether they experimented with something like that. As far as I know, they just followed more or less the system that already existed through the canal boom, which had basically taken place for the 50 years or so before the railroads came through and had a huge impact on the infrastructure of the country. So it's a really interesting question.
So, of all the areas you survey that experienced a growth in government, which one do you think that government growth and intervention caused the most net benefit to English society, and why? I gather that there's a variety of cases to be made for how justified these interventions were. Which one do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, ended up causing the most benefit?
Yeah, I think the one that really stands out, and which we've seen almost every other country adopt is government provided primary education. And I think, that's a case where, and Mill describes very clearly the sort of the market failures that you see in that case, which is fundamentally that when you have parents who are uneducated, who are illiterate, for example, they have a really hard time judging the quality of the education they're receiving, and that kind of information asymmetry, plus things like credit constraints, lead to underinvestment in education. And the British resisted a public system of education much longer than, say, the US or Germany, for example. But, they eventually felt like they really, really had to implement some sort of public system, which they didn't do until the 1870s because they were falling so far behind on that margin.
And then, do you want to give the counter to that of all of the places you surveyed? Do you think that there's an area of society where the intervention didn't work out nearly as well as planned and probably should have been done without?
Let me highlight actually two different ways that they went. So I think there are cases where they really stuck with laissez-faire, and I think trade is a great example. And I think they stuck with laissez-faire because it seemed to be working. And I think that's why we still see lots of, even though of course tariffs are remain very controversial today, we see lots of trade and relatively free trade around most of the world. And so that's an area where there was never any movement away from laissez-faire, where the laissez-faire that they adopted through things like the Corn Laws in the 1840s really stuck. And there's a couple other areas like that with personal freedoms, like religious freedom, which was part of the laissez-faire program,
I was going to mention that.
and press freedom. And these are areas where there just was never much of a movement away from that because it seemed to work really well. Now, there were other areas where things maybe, where they moved away from laissez-faire for, I think, some good reasons, and then they overshot. And the telegraph network is a case where it has some of the same issues as the railroad network. They moved a little bit towards regulation initially, mainly to try to help coordination, but then they really kind of overshot and basically nationalized the system. And the reason that they did that is because the post office was very powerful and had some institutional heft and pushed them essentially to go to nationalization. And there's still debate about how that worked out, but I think that seems like the most obvious case where they probably overshot.
Okay. I wanted to give you, I think, what my understanding is of like a broad outline of economic history and get your response to it, see if you want to push back or think I've got something wrong here. So throughout recorded history, most people live lives of pretty extreme poverty with little change from one generation to the next. And then you have the Industrial Revolution, and it starts to create a lot of new problems that didn't exist before, such as the problems that come from high concentrations of people in cities, which you document, as well as new workplace dangers that were, novel to people or familiar with the kind of dangers that come with farm life, say, but there's a lot of novel workplace dangers in factories. And in addition to creating genuinely new problems like this, it also, through concentrations of people in cities and stuff, makes a lot of existing problems more visible. Problems that had always existed, but were typically harder to see in the countryside. But that these problems ultimately were relatively small in comparison to the general improvements that were ushered in by the Industrial Revolution, and that the main story still is really this dramatic increase in living standards experienced by huge numbers of people. So that's my general understanding of economic history. Do you want to object to anything I said there or amplify anything or add any caveats?
I think you're exactly right that the Industrial Revolution ushered in huge improvements. And the more you study the past, the more you try to grapple with what people's lives were like, the sort of the more bleak it seems, particularly on the health front. And so I think that's right that, there were these huge improvements, and but those weren't sort of, completely positive. They came with some trade-offs. They produced things like pollution, these big, dense urban centers spread disease, issues like verifying the quality of products become more difficult. And so, most of what my book is about is sort of the responses around the edges, as they try to deal with some of those negative consequences of this otherwise sort of very powerful force for economic growth and improved human welfare.
I think that's a really good answer. I was trying to, make clear to myself, I think it comes through just fine in the book, but also to the audience that, you could imagine a book like yours being written, I don't know, from a non-economic perspective that really was just trashing the benefits of the Industrial Revolution or like completely questioning the gains or something like that. And I don't think that's your project here, even though there's a lot of problems to be highlighted of what's going on. To what extent do you think the problems that were seen, the new problems you raise, to what extent do you think they were genuinely new problems versus just increasingly visible existing problems?
It's a good question. So certainly many of the, like, let's take, for example, pollution, right? I mean, pollution, there's always been some pollution, I guess, since somebody, started a fire upwind of someone else. But whether that was really an issue or not, I don't know. I mean, it becomes clearly an issue in the 19th century when you have these cities that look, as far as we can tell, more polluted than the very worst polluted cities in the developing world today. Just really intense levels that are coming with lots of health costs. And so I don't know whether to call that a new problem or just a much, much worse, more intense version of an old problem. I guess if there are purely new problems, those are problems that are probably related to just complex technologies that are really difficult to understand or to grapple with for regular people. But, I think the big problems, urban disease, pollution, these kind of things, many of those are old problems that just became much more intense in these industrialized societies.
And you talk about how the British society was ultimately making these pragmatic judgments that there was less efficiency maybe than hoped for in private responses to some of these problems. One thing that occurred to me, I don't know, depending on how you look at it, this could be a private response or a public response, but rather than taking like legislative or kind of decree based action on this, I guess I'm wondering why common law civil liability wasn't able to address it, like pollution in particular. Like there's the common law tort of nuisance, and certain forms of pollution, very easily meet that threshold. Certain forms much less so, but like in densely packed cities or something. So I'm wondering, was there much pressure to allow the common law to evolve to address some of these problems more rather than pushing forward legislative constraints? Because I mean, I know the common law works slowly the way, in a way that might not have been satisfying, but it seems like that could have been a middle ground or something.
So they considered that. One of the interesting things about how they made policy during this period is that the first stop was almost always to try to take a solution that didn't involve like a direct government intervention. And so pollution's a great example. So the first real modern pollution regulation is this thing called the Alkali Acts, which are these factories, these chemical factories that are basically generating hydrochloric acid rain on, that's hitting the farms around them. And there's a quote in the book from one of these landowners who says, I could sue the person whose acid rain is falling on my farm, but there's dozens of factories in this town. And if I can't identify specific damage from a specific owner of a specific factory, then I can't shut them down and be protected. Now, maybe if the common law had evolved faster or in a different direction, maybe they would have avoided a regulatory response. But in this case, what happened was the regulators came in and they said, well, there's actually a really simple solution, which is you precipitate this stuff out before you release it into the air. And all of the factories adopted that, and it just stopped the problem in its tracks. Now, that was a kind of an easy case in the sense that there was a really simple and fairly inexpensive mitigation technology available.
Yeah, that seems like always the best case scenario is if there's a good technological solution, especially one that also benefits the user of the technology too. Yeah, I think the problem you just raised there, I don't know, solved is a big word. The common law is always evolving and tinkering around the edges, but I think the term enjoin or something. I think there's a more modern common law development that where you can sue a large chunk of an industry if you can demonstrate that the industry as a whole or something is contributing to this particular issue or harm that it's causing to you. Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman. Just want to take a quick break to tell you all I appreciate you so much for listening to the show. And it's still a new show, still a growing show. And if you want to help me out, I would greatly appreciate it. Simplest thing you could do is recommend it to a friend and give it a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Their algorithms rank the shows higher, make it more visible, make it more searchable if it has more star ratings, more reviews. So anything like that would be very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Back to the show. I was thinking about the concept of the Kuznets curve, and I'm wondering how many of these the issues that were raised in the book might follow something like that, like is there a child labor Kuznets curve where initially with initial forms of industrialization you see increasing amounts of child labor, and then as living standards raise, parents start prioritizing education and leisure time and things like that because they can afford to keep their kids home from work. So is there a relation like that with some of these issues where economic development in and of itself would ultimately tend to mitigate a lot of these issues? Probably not for all of them, but do you think that plays a role here?
Yeah, I think, child labor, so just to take that specific example, I think that's probably right? I think, that's kind of how we think the fertility transition happened. People started caring more about the quality, of the investments in their children, their health, and their education. And, I think that would have kicked in, right?
That's
This
low
is
birth rates and low death rates as the fertility transition from high
Yeah,
birth
which
rates
is
to
going to
high
kick
death rates.
in. Yeah, which is going to basically, particularly low fertility rates, which are going to come in the last quarter of the 19th century, effectively in the UK. At that point, they may have started pulling children out of factories. Now, the British government is going to regulate child labor earlier than that, and they're going to regulate them in the factories. The limitations are, by our standards, seem pretty mild in the sense that they're still going to allow 12 and 14-year-olds to work 12-hour, 5.5, 12-hour days, but they're going to start requiring some education and some safety inspections and things like that. Now, whether that's an efficiency thing, whether they could have just let the Kuznets curve find its way eventually, we don't know because we see those regulations coming in. I think in part those regulations are coming in because as incomes rise, the demand from parents is also easing.
And this is something that takes time, so they're not in a position to know that such a curve might exist. They don't have the data that we have. Something else, as long as we're talking about child labor. So one of the motivations for regulating child labor was the upper and middle classes kind of being aghast at the working conditions of children in factories, especially. It's important to remember that child labor was not new, and you acknowledge this in the book. It's been with us forever. It existed in different forms, and they thought that maybe many parents were underestimating the harms that weren't as well understood of sending their kids to work in factories for long hours. And that makes sense because a lot of the factories, again, were new and some of the harms were not well understood. Do you think it's also possible, though, that some of the upper and middle classes who were aghast at this were underestimating the value to poor families of the income that child labor brings at a time when widespread extreme poverty is the norm rather than an exception, and could maybe be the difference between eating or not or something like that?
Yeah, they're trying to grapple with this, which it's really interesting. You can go back to the 19th century and you find these reports of hundreds, sometimes even more than 1,000 pages, where they bring in doctors and they ask them, many doctors, like, does this kind of work schedule damage a child's long-term productivity throughout their life? Are we sort of inefficiently reducing their sort of long-term productivity because of these 12-hour days at age 8 or age 10? I mean, they were genuinely interested in answering those questions, and unfortunately, they didn't have, the method to actually really get at them much. And so
And that's
the
true of both the factory and the parents and the private sector as well as the government. The scientific information is, a lot of people I'm sure suspected, rightfully, but there wasn't like some repository where everyone could just get this question answered the way we maybe can now.
Exactly. But, Mill makes a really important point on this topic of child labor, which is that, even with all the laws that existed against child abuse, like direct abuse of children, right, that still didn't stop child abuse. And if some subset of parents are willing to, directly abuse them, there's probably also a subset of parents that are willing to take advantage of their children by working them harder than they really should be worked, or then you would work them if you cared about their long run potential. And that's another case where maybe the state should step in. So he makes that argument. And, and I think that's part of the thinking behind these early regulations of the labor among the very young children.
How do you think, if at all, evidence from more modern industrializing societies fits in to bolster your argument here? Is that that takes us far afield of this particular book. But I was thinking about that, like, are there similar patterns in, parts of the developing world that we're developing in the 50s and 60s or something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that fits in pretty well is that if you look at the set of regulations that these relatively pragmatic policymakers are adopting in the 19th century in the UK, those regulations have been adopted almost universally by developed countries today, right? Almost every country has some level of pollution regulation, typically has some limitations on child labor, typically has some primary publicly provided education system. And so I think, one of the things I guess that I see when I look at the countries today is that a lot of these relatively sort of early stage interventions have been widely adopted. And I think that suggests that those interventions were generally effective.
Let me a counterpoint to that I was curious about. I don't have any data on this, so this could be far off. But I'm wondering if, like, early on, is there a like follow the leader effect with the leading nations of the world that everyone wants to emulate their success? So Britain and America or other prominent countries in Europe are doing things a certain way, and you've got a lot of developing countries subsequently coming along and thinking, these are the clear policies that like a handful of countries have adopted, so let's do all of these things. And that at most probably would only be a partial causal explanation, but does that enter the picture at all?
It definitely could be part of the story. I tend to think, that if these are really inefficient policies, the countries that adopt them, at some point are going to start falling behind, right? But
Yeah, there's got to be a range for how, bad a policy can be before copying it just because the cool kid is
yeah,
doing it is not going to be at all workable.
yeah. But I think there's lots of copying going on. And there was some copying too in sort of the move towards laissez-faire, which was not something that existed. There was a lot more intervention both in the US and on the continent, and maybe there was a bit of move towards laissez-faire, but not the way that the British did it.
There was, when you say copying towards laissez-faire, you mean other countries copying Britain?
Yeah, sort of reducing somewhat their level of government intervention and at least in areas like trade, for example, or press freedom, embracing those.
You mentioned at one point that the Industrial Revolution did get started in Britain prior to this kind of rise of laissez-faire worldview, so it can't really take credit for jump-starting the Industrial Revolution. I think you say maybe it can take some credit for like encouraging its momentum. Do you have a perspective? I know it's like maybe the biggest somewhat open question in economic history about like the deep causes of the Industrial Revolution, and kind of related question, laissez-faire is a spectrum. Was Britain at the time more laissez-faire than other countries or not?
So the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, and it started before Britain really embraced laissez-faire to the extent that it did in the 19th century. But I think the British institutional environment did matter. And there's lots of sort of classic work, including work by Doug North, about, the extent to which you needed at least some limitation on government intervention, on the capacity of the sovereign to just take your stuff to encourage people to innovate. And I think that's probably right. Beyond that, I think, the Industrial Revolution, I could talk to you for hours about the things that I think contributed there, but it's really just it's a big, complex topic that I think we're still very actively researching.
Is there a tension between Britain embracing this spirit of small government at the same time as being like the largest empire in the world? So like Britain's foreign policy and imperial ambitions, how does that fit in with its embrace of the small government worldview?
Yeah, that's a great question. The true answer is that they saw no contradiction in governing other people very differently than how they governed themselves. And so this laissez-faire idea, and that's not necessarily true of everybody, but in general, this is an idea, this is a system that they applied domestically. They extended some of those features to the empire, but much of the empire they treated just very, very differently. And that didn't seem like a contradiction to them.
That again would be a whole nother book or series of books or something. But do you have any sense of what kinds of factors encouraged them to govern their imperial holdings more or less the way they governed themselves in a laissez-faire way?
So just let me add a little bit of nuance to that previous answer, which is that there were definitely some people who I think saw the contradictions in the way that Britain was treating the empire versus how it was the rights given to British citizens, or English in particular, citizens domestically, because the Irish.
Herbert Spencer, for instance.
Yeah, the Irish too were treated differently, and things were done in Ireland that I don't think they could have done in England. I'm not an expert on the empire. I know more about what they were doing in Ireland, which had definitely, connections to what they were doing in the rest of the UK, but was very different in things like policing. They, imposed a much stronger policing system than they would have ever been able to impose in England, and they felt fine doing that.
I really enjoyed your chapter on policing because you talk about how it's a difficult area to analyze in terms of the growth or retrenchment of laissez-faire, because most laissez-faire activists are small government classical liberals, and that small government includes protection of person and property through a police force. So is the expansion of a centralized private or government police force, does that mean laissez-faire is retrenching, or does it mean it's growing? It's just an interesting question.
Yeah, and it's not entirely true. And there were plenty of people who felt that the policing should just remain an essentially sort of informal voluntary activity, that there shouldn't be some department responsible for doing this. But I think that's another case where the sort of older system of like informal town watches just had problems once it started confronting the types of crime that existed as the country industrialized.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the book makes the case that, as you said, there's this pragmatic reason that Britain kind of gradually piecemeal abandoned small government, that there were market failures. They didn't have the language of market failure back then, but there were things that economists understand now to be times and situations where, let's say, individual rationality doesn't lead to group rationality, or something like that. Are there parallel arguments, do you think, for government failure from, say, like the public choice school that would cut against some of the market failure arguments that would lead to government intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, these are cases where there's probably some, in cases where there seems like there's, some sort of, let's call it like something that looks like a pure market failure, like a air pollution or like a real strong information asymmetry problem, the kinds of problems we understand today. Right. I mean, we know that, that the market is not going to be efficient in those cases, but, the government intervention is only going to be, an improvement to the extent that government is not sort of even more inefficient. And I think that's the fundamental problem that we grapple with today, is sort of where is that balance between the inefficiencies inherent in market failures and the sort of possibility that the government could be even less efficient in solving those. And I think the approach that they took, which I find very interesting to this problem, is sort of inching government interventions very slowly forward to try to sort of see in each step how it was going, whether it seemed to be making things better or worse. It was a very empirical and kind of conservative approach to intervening in most policy areas.
What was your favorite of all of the specific subject chapters? What was your favorite chapter to write?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of
Am I making you pick between your babies?
there's a lot of chapters that I think are really interesting. There were some where I didn't know a lot about the topic before I got started, and I learned a lot. So, like the food quality regulation, which also sort of embraced this drug quality regulation and the sort of the whole opioid epidemic that they had at that time. That's kind of an interesting case because of the parallels that we see, and some of the challenges that we're dealing with today. So they had essentially a big opioid problem at the time as well. And they were also grappling with it. Again, they were moving from a purely free market, in a very limited way towards regulation in that case. That's just one case where I think I learned a lot.
Do you have any recommendations for books that you think complement your book especially well?
Let's see. I have to say I'm a big fan of my colleague Joel Mokier's work. And so I think, for example, his book, Culture of Growth, which is sort of another written around this time, is a really interesting book that covers a little bit of the same ground with a different focus. So that might be an interesting one.
I read that as well, and I also really enjoyed it. So A Culture of Growth by Joel Mokyr. Are you working on any upcoming projects right now that you want to mention?
So the main project that I'm working on at the moment, or just finishing off at the moment, is about the role of engineering in the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of engineering as a new profession, really, in the UK, which might strike people as kind of a bold claim, given that, we know that the Romans, for example, were, building all of these amazing monuments. But basically, the claim is that the way innovation was done changed in the 19th century through the emergence of this professional class of inventors, which came to be central to the innovation system. And we call those inventors engineers. And that basically, magnified the effects of the Industrial Revolution by increasing our ability to innovate more rapidly.
Is this a working paper right now, or is this going to be a book?
Yeah, so it's a working paper that's just got accepted. And it may end up being a book too, because these guys are just very interesting. And they had I think at least, a really profound effect on, how invention was done and, through that on the sort of the global economy.
And I'm sorry, maybe you just said this, but is this focusing on Britain as well, or more
Yeah,
broadly European?
it's focusing on Britain, where I think sort of as part of the Industrial Revolution, this class of inventors emerges. And there are people called engineers who existed in other places, but this profession as a private profession with a focus on invention and design work, I think that emerged in Britain during this period is really somewhat unique and ended up being really important.
Is it kind of like a merging of like more high abstract scientists with like more commercial tinkerers?
Yeah, so there's two ways to think of it. One is they're the bridge between science and the sort of the tinkerers that got the Industrial Revolution started. So Joel Mokyr, my colleague, talks about tinkerers and this sort of very practical knowledge of people like millwrights and stuff, right? The engineers were the next generation, and they basically took that practical knowledge and they combined it with scientific insights. And they were able to do that because they specialized. And so I also think of them in sort of a Adam Smith meets modern economic growth, right? That the specialization makes people more productive, but the specialization in this case is in the process of innovation, which makes it particularly important.
So the tinkerers that Mokyr referred to were maybe more of generalists, and then the following generation starts to specialize in more narrow ways and get better and better at what they're doing. Is that the idea?
Exactly. And it's really an endogenous response. So the market is growing, and that market growth allows people to begin specializing in innovation. And as they begin specializing in innovation, sort of as Adam Smith predicted with his pin factory, they would become more productive at that. And that, because innovation is so important for economic growth, that just magnifies the impact of the Industrial Revolution on growth.
Is it kind of a feedback where people specialize more, get better at some particular form of tinkering, and as a result produce more and better products, which might entice consumers to grow the market more through more purchases and something like that? I mean, I'm sure it asymptotes and ends it somewhere, but there's a feedback mechanism that goes on.
Yeah, that's the right way to think about it. And you can see it empirically in the patent data, which is the primary data set that I use in the paper, where you see that this new emerging group of engineers, they're producing better stuff, higher quality stuff, and they're producing more, and they're producing it across a wider range of different technology types. So they just look very different than the older type of inventor in the patent data, which is primarily a manufacturer inventor. So someone who runs a little textile factory and occasionally produces a textile machine.
Well, that's really cool. Did you already say, is there a working title for the paper?
Yeah, it's The Rise of the Engineer.
Okay, very cool. And where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
You can find me on the web. That's the best spot, at walkerhanlon.com.
Awesome. WalkerHanlon.com. So you got your own website. My guest today has been Walker Hanlon, and his excellent book is The Laissez-Faire Experiment: Why Britain Embraced and Then Abandoned Small Government, 1800 to 1914. Please check it out. Walker, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Great, Chris. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.